This guy covered the Nostalgia Critic's review of The Phantom Menace? That's a little odd, given that never happened. Fuck, when Doug did a top 11 movies he was never going to review as the Nostalgia Critic, Phantom Menace was at number 1.
And the number one thing I will never do a Nostalgia Critic review on is Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace.
Now, Doug did cover these movies as part of Disney-cember. Anomaly even plays the Disney-cember intro when he begins commentating on Doug's video. However, that's not the same thing as the Nostalgia Critic reviewing them, because the Nostalgia Critic is a specific character Doug Walker plays. To the point where when Doug addressed things he said in his Disney-cember reviews as the Nostalgia Critic, he had to make it clear he was breaking out of the Nostalgia Critic character in order to be able to do such.
Your countless Disney-cember fuck-ups! Okay, I'm going a little bit out of character here just to talk about the few mistakes I made in Disney-cember.
It would be like if I actually went around calling Tom Kenny SpongeBob SquarePants, or saying Sylvester Stallone is Rocky Balboa, and actually reporting on the opinions of those two individuals by saying their characters said those opinions. The video opens with a clip from the Nostalgia Critic's Last Jedi review where he says that he likes the film because although he does acknowledge it has problems, said issues don't bother him, followed by Lord of the Rings footage, I guess? With people's heads photoshopped so it looks like they're talking about Star Wars. I've seen other people do this joke before. I don't normally like it very much, but that's just a me thing, so I won't hold it against the video. But I normally know what they're trying to communicate. Here, I'm just fucking lost. The video continues with a 2-minute long clip show made up of Mark Hamill and George Lucas talking about Star Wars, with Mark Hamill specifically expressing dislike for how people talked about the prequel films, and George Lucas more generally, along with a song that has an admittedly rather distasteful chorus, so I am not going to be playing it. Even ignoring how dragged out I find this part of the video to be, I am also incredibly bothered by the implication that certain people agree with rhetoric that they bluntly do not. For example, Anomaly shows Mark Hamill talking about Jake Lloyd and saying the following.
I'm still angry about the way they treated Jake Lloyd. He was only 10 years old, that boy, and he did exactly what George wanted him to do. Believe me, I understand clunky dialogue.
You know who totally agrees with the idea that people were too harsh on Jake Lloyd? Doug Walker. With the demo reel episode, Blue Patches, essentially just being one long takedown of people who held Jake Lloyd's bad performance in The Phantom Menace over his head. Oh, and since you put this picture on screen when you showed Mark Hamill talking about Jake Lloyd, I should make it known that Jake Lloyd's mother, albeit not until several years after this video was released, has made it clear that dislike of his performance in episode 1 had nothing to do with his bad mental health. That was a result of a combination of genetics and a tragic family event. Again, I'm not blaming you for not knowing that, especially considering that was the common narrative at the time. However, I figured I should correct the record since it was brought up. Similarly, when you play the aforementioned distastefully chorused song, I can't help but notice that you show a screenshot of the Plinkett review of episode 3, which specifically mocked that kind of rhetoric.
But still, a lot of you will claim that I'm one of those people that says George Lucas ruined my childhood. Now that's just crazy talk. George Lucas didn't ruin my childhood. Fucking polio did.
Doug also criticizes this rhetoric, by the way, in the very review Anomaly is covering in a clip he even plays.
If you're one of those people that claim Lucas killed your childhood, you never had a childhood to begin with. or you're constantly trying to stay in it and reject your grown-up world.
For those curious, here is his response to that part of the video, although, fair warning, this is the first clip I've shown which reveals his tendency to frequently use a certain word widely considered offensive that starts with the letter R. If that word bothers you, then again, fair warning, we're going to be hearing it quite a bit.
And those were the retards people reference as a credible review for this film?
Again, this guy objectively does not agree with that rhetoric. You could have figured this out just by watching his reviews. Also, I'm sorry, but what does other people citing them as credible reviews have to do with anything? Is Doug doing that? Not to my knowledge. And if he is doing so, you provide absolutely no evidence to back up this claim. And yeah, if it isn't obvious already, Anomaly doesn't seem to like Red Letter Media all that much. He even includes a random response to a point from a Red Letter Media video in this commentary, which is supposed to be about Doug Walker. You see, it's part of a larger point that starts with Doug saying the following.
But he had a lot of people to give him advice and limitations, so it still turned out a good product. Then, years later, after barely directing a thing, this guy is suddenly supposed to direct a masterpiece?
Anomaly then responds with this.
Okay, this is a really stupid argument. Yes, Lucas works better when he has people to collaborate with and give him advice. That's true for every single writer, director, or creator out there. It's true for Christopher Nolan, Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, and Ridley Scott.
And the fact that it is debunks Doug's point how exactly? If anything, it confirms it.
And that doesn't mean no one was questioning his decisions on the sets of the prequels.
Doug never said otherwise, you just added that claim.
And no, the brief snippets of the documentary can't prove that false.
Wait, the documentary? Which documentary are you talking about? Can you please name it?
Let's bring up Plinkett's review for a second. His review shows a few snippets which easily could have been taken out of context.
What do you mean by easily could have been? Were they taken out of context or not? Because, yeah, I guess they theoretically could be. Any clip could theoretically be taken out of context. Are you going to go through these clips and explain what the context actually is? Because if not, then all you're doing is just sort of raising the possibility without any real reason to believe it's the case.
Not to mention his own interpretation, as he likes to call it.
Later on, after everybody started drinking, Lucas attempts to explain his newly minted bowel movement as bold and extreme, stylistic.
It's stylistically designed to be that way, and you can't undo that, but we can diminish the effects of it.
No one looks like they know what's going on, and they all look like they're about to start pointing fingers. But that's just my interpretation of this footage. I wasn't there.
Without the slightest morsel of humility in the statement, tries to encourage the audience to take his words as facts.
Where did you get that exactly? Because, if anything, that sounds like the exact opposite of what Plinkett is doing, given he specifically acknowledges, as you admit, that he is only interpreting the footage and therefore could very well be wrong.
Something Chris Stuckman, Jeremy Johns, and I Hate Everything have all done in the past, by the way. And now I guess we can add you to that list.
And your evidence for this is fuck if I know. And it's especially notable given in 3 of these 4 people's cases, again, you don't even prove they've said this, and in Doug's case, you don't have any reason to believe he's specifically using Red Letter Media as a source. That's something you just kind of assume with, best as I can tell, no reasoning whatsoever. I should also note, Anomaly has a habit of trying to lump Doug Walker in with all the other members of the amorphous blob known as prequel detractors, saying this early on, for example.
I found a lot of enjoyment in his Last Jedi Nostalgia Critic video. My issue with it lies with his lack of consistency. especially given how he bashed the prequels like many others in the YouTube anti-prequel status quo circle jerk.
Except Doug isn't a prequel basher by any stretch of the imagination. Again, he's never done Nostalgia Critic episodes dedicated to bashing the prequels. Although he did do a Nostalgia Critic on 11 things he thought the prequels did right, which you clip from, by the way.
Back in 2015, when this video was released, it was peak prequel hate. And it was very common to get chastised for even paying them a compliment.
Well, in my opinion, there is one other thing to talk about. The good stuff. Hear me out.
Which, side note, I believe he's trying to use this clip to prove that people were chastised for liking the prequels, but you understand this is a joke, right? Not something that really happened. It's not even an original one to the Nostalgia Critic series. He basically did the same bit in his James and the Giant Peach review, except there it was with criticism of the movie as opposed to compliments towards it.
Look! That cloud looks like a camel. And that one over there looks like a train engine.
And that one looks like a crappy CGI effect. I mean, a good CGI effect. Yeah, how do you think that'd go over? Probably better. That's right, Randy Newman wrote these songs. Oh, and just like his other work, it's lame, annoying, repetitive, unoriginal, inspiring, charming, wonderful piece of music that I expect from such a musical genius. And that's James and the Giant Peach. It's fantastic, glorious, stupendous! But if I was to find some fault with it, just hear me out, just hear me out!
This isn't Doug saying that there's this giant group of militant James and the Giant Peach fans out there trying to prevent people from criticizing the movie. This is just him making a joke. Anyway, speaking of points that I can disprove through playing clips of Nostalgia Critic videos, here's Anomaly discussing Doug's opinion on CGI. It begins with Doug listing a bunch of complaints people tend to have with the film.
My complaints are your complaints. The acting is so wooden, the writing so 5th grade, the effects way too computer generated, the comedy way too kindergarten.
To which Anomaly replies with,
Let's start with the computer generated bullshit argument first. First off, The Phantom Menace had arguably more practical effects than the entire original trilogy combined. That retarded anti-CGI Nazism argument holds about as much weight as a fart in outer space.
Except Doug isn't anti-CGI, that's just not a position he holds. His video, Has CGI Gone Too Far, actually sees him providing a very nuanced take on the topic, discussing circumstances where it is more appropriate than other effects, while also acknowledging that, at the time at least, it was being incredibly overused in films, to the exclusion of other things which would have worked far better. Saying that this, along with people just not really understanding how CG worked, are problems, but he makes it clear the problem is not with computer-generated imagery itself.
So, should we be sick of CGI? In some respects, but I don't think that means stop it altogether. CGI is great for creating worlds and illusions, but it shouldn't probably be used for every part of that world or every element of those illusions. Every story is going to tell itself differently, and if the idea is to be like a magic trick where you know it's an illusion but you appreciate the showmanship anyway, CGI is going to be great. But if the idea is to tell a story where the illusion is supposed to completely fool you, then it's probably wiser to mix it up with models, puppets, and other practical effects. As an art form, it's come a long way, and opened up all sorts of avenues and visual wonders. But people forget how many avenues can be opened up by combining old tricks with new tricks, and can often create much more powerful illusions. So, CGI shouldn't go away or be criticized for all that it's done, but it should be acknowledged as only one method that can be used in creating an effect. Not just for the sake of variety and creativity, but because the common person is just catching on to it.
And by the way, Doug even praises some uses of the CGI in this video. Once again, in a clip you play.
As tiring as the constant CG gets in this, there are a lot of very neat landscapes. The worlds are very creative and very beautiful to look at.
Anomaly goes on to list some examples of practical effects in The Phantom Menace. I have absolutely no issue with this part, so I'm just fast-forwarding through it.
The CGI argument applies only to Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, as they were heavily used in effect as a stylistic choice by George, who wanted to experiment. And let's be frank, back in 2000 and 2001, no production dared to push the boundaries like George and his team did. Hell, ILM had to invent some of the technology themselves.
You got a source for that? Not even saying you're wrong, would just like some evidence.
Pursuing a stylistic choice, or more accurately, pioneering one, should be commended, not condemned.
What if the stylistic choice in question is bad, though? I mean, you just called Doug an anti-CGI Nazi, I assume not unlike the ones that invaded France.
So the droid army just rolls in, unchallenged as expected. Just like the Nazis into France in a little historical event you might have heard of. What was it called? The French Revolution.
So obviously he's not going to think very highly of films which caused CGI to get more prominence within the realm of movies. Sometimes people are trailblazers in ways that are bad. You do understand that, right? I also want to point out that this interjection sees him trying to use a scene from Phantom Menace as an example of Qui-Gon refusing to use the Jedi mind trick. But actually watching it, it's very clear that if Qui-Gon wasn't doing such, it's at least heavily implied by the narrative.
And speed is on our way.
We're gonna speed you away.
We could use a transporter.
We give you una bongo.
For the record, the version of the clip he shows in this video just cuts out the other character's response.
And speed is on our way. We could use a transporter.
This is even the interpretation of other mediums the movie was adapted to. The novelization, for example, reads, "Before Obi-Wan could continue his argument, Qui-Gon stepped forward. Then speed us on our way," he demanded, bringing up one hand in a casual motion, passing it smoothly before the Gungan chief's eyes in a quick invocation of Jedi mind powers. Boss Nass stared at him, then nodded, "We speed yous far away." Lego Star Wars similarly makes it clear in the cutscene representing this part of the movie that Qui-Gon is using a Jedi mind trick. Notice the sparkles that come out of Qui-Gon's hand and appear on Boss Nass's head. And by the way, what about the scene where Qui-Gon tries to mind trick Watto and doesn't manage to?
Saying which, how's he gonna pay for all of this?
I have 20,000 Republic dactaries.
Republic credits? Republic credits are no good out here. I need something more real.
I don't have anything else, but credits will do fine.
No, they won't.
Credits will do fine.
No, they won't! What, you think you're some kind of Jedi waving your hand around like that? I'm a Toydarian. My tricks don't work on me. Only money.
Going back to the novelization, it directly says that the second time Qui-Gon waves his hand in that scene, he is, quote, bringing the full force of his Jedi suggestive power to bear. While on this topic, I want to note this is part of an interjection discussing Qui-Gon's character, and I just want to highlight this part real quick.
While, on the other hand, his apprentice Obi-Wan is much more subservient to following the rules, which is why he and his master have a conflict of ideals throughout the film. And this actually gets brought up again by Count Dooku in Attack of the Clones.
He then plays a clip from Attack of the Clones, which doesn't have anything to do with the conversation, given that's not the Star Wars movie we're talking about. Also, this is just something the villain of the movie says with no backing in universe, best as I can tell. It's completely possible Count Dooku is just lying through his teeth here because, well, he's the bad guy. They do that sometimes. I mean, for fuck's sake, the villain of this entire trilogy is a person lying about who he is so he can take over the current political system.
As for their monotone acting, that is a design choice by Lucas. Again, Lucas had control over everything, right? And the Jedi are meant to be emotionless, as explained by Yoda in the movie. No fear, attachment, anger, compassion, hate, or love. Rejecting Anakin for being too old when he was just a kid at the time is another excellent part of the world building, since it recontextualized the Jedi to being indoctrinated to think this way since early childhood. And this accounts for the whole Jedi Council too, and eliminates such arguments as they're all boring and Mace Windu is bland and boring. How else would you expect them to be?
But it doesn't eliminate those arguments. At absolute most, it contextualizes them. However, one can still call it a nonsensical decision on the part of the movie, essentially sacrificing quality for the sake of having this aspect of the universe present.
Queen Amidala is monotone and assertive when she is the queen. When she's just Padme, she shows a much more human side because she's not being observed as a monarch.
Okay, how? Do you have any evidence to back this up? Well, this time he does, but he doesn't play it for a little bit, which is a bit of an odd choice, but nothing major. Essentially, after going through a bunch of the other characters in The Phantom Menace, he shows two scenes, one with Amidala and one with Anakin. The one with Queen Amidala is the following.
You're thinking you're people gonna die?
I don't know.
Gungans get pasted too, eh?
I hope not.
Which, I'm sorry, but Amidala was incredibly monotone in that scene. Is there something I'm missing here? Because if so, it's not explained at all. And by the way, other claims about characters in this interjection aren't backed up. Like this one, for example.
The Queen's captain is another static character. He's always overly serious and has a lot of good one-liners.
Okay, like what? You've already established that you can show clips of the movie to back up your point, so why not play a couple of his one-liners? Anomaly also addresses the complaint that many of the characters in The Phantom Menace are stereotypes. So let's discuss that.
They buy Anakin from one stereotype to deliver him to two other stereotypes.
Motherfucker, they're aliens. They can be whatever George fucking wants them to be.
Okay, first off, no they can't. They can't, for example, be both aliens and humans. That's just not what that word means in this context. But second off, yeah, they could theoretically be almost anything George Lucas wants, and that includes stereotypical depictions of people on Earth. Media has based fictional creatures off of racial stereotypes before, you know that, right? The aliens in the comic series Kathmandu serve as an example of this, as they were based off of Native Americans.
And seriously, those clowns who brought race into this were really grasping at straws.
Anomaly then plays a clip of George Lucas discussing the backlash Jar Jar got, who wasn't actually one of the characters Doug mentioned. He was talking about Watto and Newt Gunray when he called certain characters stereotypes, not Jar Jar. With Lucas saying the whole reason Jar Jar's even getting all this backlash is because of a dislike of comic sidekicks some Star Wars fans have. It's a total ad hominem. Don't actually engage with the point. Instead, cherry pick one claim and use it as a reason to cast the entire conclusion as ridiculous before wildly speculating about why people are believing this, as opposed to engaging with the evidence provided. For those curious why certain people view Jar Jar as a racial stereotype, the LA Times actually covered that controversy in 1999 when the movie came out, and noted how many people were reminded of genuinely racist and offensive caricatures of black people that used to be prevalent in media in the 1930s and 40s when they saw Jar Jar. Similarly, TV Tropes notes that people thought Watto was a stereotype due to him being fat, ugly, having a big nose, being a business owner, and even having a hat that looks somewhat like a yarmulke. Meanwhile, Newt Gunray has slit eyes, is inscrutable, speaks in a somewhat Asian accent, and wears Qing Dynasty-inspired robes and hats. I should also note this video has a few of these moments where Anomaly will cut to a clip of George Lucas, and that's not in of itself a problem. However, I take issue with using it to back up subjective points. Creators of films are not infallible and occasionally can't even see the flaws of their own work. There's a reason why a friend of mine checks these videos. Because sometimes I'm just not able to see the flaws in what I'm making. And that's the case for a lot of people. Why should we not be under the impression that George Lucas is one of them? That he just doesn't see the issues in his film? You give us no reason to believe otherwise. I'm also forced to wonder how far this logic goes. Is the creator of the film the final say? Because if so, then I have quite a few responses to that. When Captain Logan reviewed the movie Supergirl for his series Superhero Rewind, he noted how, after seeking out material where people who were behind the movie discussed it, several of them defended it. He then broke down their arguments, along with other presuppositions he noticed they had about screenwriting and making a movie, in order to explain why they didn't make any sense, and therefore why the film didn't work. Although it wasn't nearly as much of a focus, Captain Logan also took time to respond to defenses made by those behind the film when he reviewed Howard the Duck. I mention this because I'm unsure how arguments like this could respond to the reviews I mentioned, ones which explicitly disagree with the creator, and essentially took the view that their defenses for the films had logical problems to them. George Lucas having said something is not the same as that being a trump card, essentially. Here he plays a clip of George Lucas giving a basic outline of the premise of the film. I assume to make it clear the film is easy to follow and it tells us everything we need to know, except that's not really Lucas's call to make, it's the audience's. Lucas may have felt the film was easy to follow and everything was adequately explained. Doug doesn't agree.
I grew up in Australia and I hadn't heard this ridiculous argument until the internet told me when I was in my 20s, so fuck off.
Why don't you actually explain why it's ridiculous outside of chastising Doug for even having made it in the first place? Because that's all you really did. You didn't respond to anything, you just sort of said, oh, well that doesn't make much sense, without giving any real explanation. It's genuinely just the argumentative equivalent of,
I mean, come on, you guys. There's no way. No, man. Oh, can't do that.
Also, what was with this mention of you first hearing the claim in your 20s? If you had heard it in your teens, would it be more valid? I'm really confused.
Also, no, they didn't buy Anakin. Pay attention. Qui-Gon bargained for him by means of gambling and delivered him to the Jedi Council.
Okay, that is actually a valid point on Anomaly's part. At worst, it's a tad nitpicky, but that's really it. Now watch as he takes this minor error in what Doug says and blows it out of proportion.
Really shows the lack of effort you put into this review, if we can even call it that.
That's objectively what this is. What about Doug's video makes you question if it counts as a review? Even as a joke, that doesn't make any sense.
The reason why a lot of anti-prequel arguments are weak is because of the internet echo chamber that formerly existed for it. People didn't give two shits if what the person was saying was true or false, just as long as he's trashing a movie they personally didn't like. So the content creator in question puts an extreme lack of effort into his or her argumentation.
All this over an incredibly small mistake that didn't even really impact Doug's point. I don't even have a problem with it being pointed out. I do take umbrage with you treating this as some sort of smoking gun that Doug was just giving into the anti-prequels echo chamber or whatever. For those curious, there are still more comments he makes about the prequels detractors. Early on, he essentially says they are mindless sheep.
The following percentage of sheep didn't really follow suit until one such fanboy as yourself told them to after establishing an early platform for themselves on YouTube.
Just a real quick note, by the way, Doug didn't build up his audience on YouTube. He was actually forced off of YouTube due to copyright issues, and as a result, migrated to Blip.tv, which was an old video hosting website from back in the day. Hence why when the New York Times profiled Doug Walker and Mike Machad in 2011, they specifically made note of how Doug was doing this independent of YouTube. I also want to highlight another part of this interjection because it just has its own logical error.
The majority either had no way to voice themselves or were simply drowned out by the true toxic fandom.
Thumbs way down.
You didn't like it?
No, I think I deserve a public apology from George Lucas.
What was even slightly toxic about this guy? He just calmly stated that he didn't like the movie in question with a touch of hyperbole. Later on, he makes note of original trilogy fanboys who criticize the prequels for things that also applied to the original films, while acknowledging that Doug wasn't doing that anyway.
It just kind of came down to logical deduction. Lucas only directed one Star Wars film, and as impressive as it was, it had a lot of problems. The writing was hokey, the acting was stilted, and there's a lot of things that didn't always make sense.
I can, to a certain extent, respect you for taking off the nostalgia goggles, no pun intended. One of the biggest issues with people who criticize the prequels, namely the original trilogy fanboys, is that the same logic for a lot of the arguments can be used in reverse.
What was even slightly toxic about this guy? He just calmly stated that he didn't like the movie in question with a touch of hyperbole. Later on, he makes note of original trilogy fanboys who criticize the prequels for things that also applied to the original films, while acknowledging that Doug wasn't doing that anyway. Anyway, here's another point he makes about Jar Jar.
The stereotype's way too offensive. Yeah, what else can I say about this that every other person on the planet hasn't said?
Again, the aliens can be whatever they want. If you see stereotypes within them, I think that says more about you than it does about the creator.
Did you just, he who smelt it, dealt it, racism? Did you really? He who smelt it, dealt it, racism? All right.
By the way, this point includes a rather superfluous mention of people saying they dislike the prequels for attention back then, just like how people say they don't like Trump now for the same reason.
Prequel hate for attention back then was as common as I hate Trump is today to garner attention, regardless of the substance or lack thereof in your arguments.
He then plays a clip of actor Robert De Niro saying "fuck Trump" and people applauding. This holds no relevance to the video at hand and as such is entirely pointless. That's not his only defense, by the way. I just need to mention this attempt to, I think, call Doug a hypocrite.
And I don't recall anyone minded that the Empire were essentially space Nazis in the original trilogy. So wait, you can formulate an argument that George Lucas was racist because of how he portrayed his aliens, but completely ignore the Empire looking and acting and dressing like officers of Nazi Germany? You need your fucking head examined in that case.
But those are incredibly different things. You do understand that, right? Creating villains that have similarities to an infamously authoritarian and genocidal regime like the Nazis is not the same as using racial stereotypes for the basis of your character. If only because one sees you lampooning an ideology while the other sees you mocking people for immutable characteristics. And if we were to really take that logic to its conclusion, then, well, do you think that, say, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, a movie that made the Nazis villains, is the same as one of the censored 11 Looney Tunes shorts? Because that just doesn't make any sense. Now, this was all in response to Doug saying the following.
Anakin, it turns out, is a virgin birth. Yeah, can't get any more obvious than that.
This is something Anomaly essentially concedes to, so instead of arguing Doug's point, he just says that other pieces of media did that as well.
But yeah, the OT was inspired by real-world events and myths, so the argument against Anakin's birth doesn't really apply unless you're willing to criticize the OT as well.
Star Wars was primarily inspired by old Flash Gordon serials, not real-world events.
What can I say about the most despised movie prequel in cinema history?
Well, if you want to call it the most despised prequel of history, that would only be because Star Wars has, or rather had, the most populated fan base in Western movie culture, or pop culture.
Therefore, Doug's statement is entirely accurate. Because of how large the Star Wars fanbase was, the amount of people who dislike the prequels is automatically going to be larger than the amount of people who would dislike a bad prequel in essentially any other series. Also, do you have any evidence Star Wars has the biggest fan base? I'm not even saying that's incorrect, I would just like a citation.
If you want to count the 20,000 butthurt fanboys who had nothing better to do with their lives than bitch about it incessantly online in the AOL chat rooms, that was like 1% of the fan base.
Even if this were the case, and I don't believe it is the case, just for the record, 1% of the Star Wars fan base is still more in raw numbers than entire fan bases, assuming the statistic you cited earlier was correct. Your response to Doug's statement essentially boils down to arguing the amount of people who dislike Phantom Menace are just a very vocal minority. However, a vocal minority in a large enough group can eclipse entire majorities. Again, assuming we're just judging things off of how many people hold a certain view.
Well, I can say this. Who has two thumbs and totally saw it coming? This guy.
Wait, are you fucking serious right now? You're actually going to claim to have predicted that the Phantom Menace, in your words, was going to be terrible. This is the selling point for your video on a topic which had already been played out at the time? When the internet was full of videos trying to siphon views from this ridiculous trend? No one saw it coming but me.
For the most part, yeah, don't get me wrong, there are some minor issues in your description, such as the fact that Doug didn't say he was the only one to predict the Phantom Menace was going to be bad, just that he predicted it. Plus, there's you throwing in the completely unproven notion that people make videos on the Phantom Menace to siphon views and not just because they want to talk about Star Wars. But yeah, for the most part, that is an albeit rather cynical description of what's happening right now. What's the point of this interjection? Oh yeah, this video is full of presumptions about Doug's character, by the way. Here's one from a couple of minutes later.
But let's cut the bullshit, Doug. You were sucking George Lucas's dick just like everyone else was at the time. Every single one of them.
How do you know this? What gave you this impression? Do you have any evidence to back up your claim? No? Then why are you saying this? A little later, Doug is just unable to predict when things are bad because he can't predict anything.
Though, in all fairness, even I couldn't guess it'd be this bad.
That's because it wasn't, and you can't predict a damn thing. You couldn't predict a death on The Walking Dead if your life depended on it, Doug.
Again, how he came across such information, I have no idea. And by the way, it's not even like he believes Doug's claim of having predicted the Phantom Menace being bad. Here's him demonstrating how he doesn't believe it through a media clip.
That's right, I've been waiting years for these bragging rights, and now it's finally come. I knew from the first trailer that this was gonna be a bad movie.
Anybody else's bullshit detector just go off?
Clearly yours didn't, given you go on to make claims in this video which only make sense through the lens of Doug having predicted that the Phantom Menace was not going to be a good movie.
They tried to help the newly elected child Queen Amidala, which you don't elect queens and queens can't be children, but whatevs.
And who decided that exactly? Was it you? This is Star Wars, mate. George Lucas could have made a fucking cat the king of the galaxy if he wanted to.
I just want to take a moment to acknowledge his citing of King Henry VI, even though he was a king, not a queen. Now, you aren't wrong that George Lucas could decide the term queen means whatever he wants. However, when that word is used in our universe, it typically refers to an older political leader who got their position not through being democratically elected, but because of either marriage or being the child of the previous ruler. They also tend to rule autocratically, although that is by no means a requirement of the definition on its own. Because of that, if you present us something which breaks away from that understanding, it's going to be met with skepticism due to it just not matching how we understand the world to work. Still, Doug's statement that these can't be the case is a little inaccurate, but it's clear what he's referring to say the very least.
It's simply a Naboo custom.
How do you know that? Who endowed you with such information? Where did you get this knowledge?
And her age is never a relevant plot point and therefore doesn't require explanation in the film. That's what EU shit is for. You know, the extended universe that Disney, in all their fucking wisdom, decided to decanonize.
The extended universe was never considered canon in the first place, and Lucas had stated so multiple times. Lucas even once called them, in an interview put on the special edition DVDs for the original trilogy, quote, another author's interpretation of what I've created, and not to be taken seriously as far as what is going on in the Star Wars world.
And along the way, they come across the death of comedy, Jar Jar Binks, and the death of acting, Anakin Skywalker.
Ah, yes. Child Anakin and Jar Jar. Every OT fanboy's favorite crutch when they're whining about these movies. Let's be frank, there's no real valid argument against these two that I've heard besides I just don't like them. Which is fine, perfectly fine. It's perfectly fine to not like a character for whatever reason. But how do each of these characters detract from the film exactly?
Through being bad characters, they detract from the film because the film would have been better off if they weren't in it. What kind of question even is that?
In terms of their characters, yes, Jar Jar was a more lighthearted, comical character for the younger demographic. Whether or not you find him annoying is purely subjective. And he was obnoxious and annoying by design. Hell, even the other characters in the movie found him annoying. So calling him an annoying character really isn't saying much. You need to be more specific.
But Doug didn't call Jar Jar annoying. The only thing he said about Jar Jar up until this point in the commentary is that he doesn't find Jar Jar to be funny. Those are not the same thing. But Doug didn't call Jar Jar annoying. The only thing he said about Jar Jar up until this point in the commentary is that he doesn't find Jar Jar to be funny. Those are not the same thing.
Without Jar Jar, they wouldn't have been able to find the Gungans and form an alliance.
Yes, they would have. This is an entirely fictional story, so therefore anything was possible by definition. George Lucas just decided the story was going to go a certain way. If he determined otherwise, there would have been nothing that stopped him. He then goes on to essentially say that Doug is wrong because a point Doug didn't say contradicts something Anomaly doesn't agree with. For those curious, it makes no more sense in context.
It simply doesn't adhere to your liking or predetermined vision for what the character should have been. And to say that he should have been anything other than what the creator wanted is invalid criticism because you don't get to dictate the creator's vision. You can only criticize when the creator contradicts himself or breaks his own rules in terms of their writing.
Says fucking who? Where is that written? Where did you get that idea? And furthermore, who are you to dictate how Doug does his reviews? And I normally wouldn't make a point like that, but if you want to say that Doug has no right to dictate how the prequels should have been done, which isn't what he's doing, by the way, he is just stating his opinion, then I'm going to sit here and ask on whose authority you have the right to determine that Doug can't. Anyway, my final thoughts are essentially that the arguments in this video weren't very good. Good night and good luck.